Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. Today we'll cover Trump's newly struck licensing deal with Nvidia and AMD, concerns about AI-driven economic bubbles, and AI adoption in the federal government. I'm Brielle Hill, and with me, as always, is Greg Allen. Hey, Greg.
Hello, great to be talking with you again. We're back pretty quick this time.
Yeah, 2 weeks in a row. Let's keep it rolling. Well, speaking of, last week I promised that H20 export controls would continue to be a recurring topic on this podcast. I wasn't kidding, but I actually didn't think it would be literally the next week that we'd be talking about it. But on August 10th, several media outlets reported that Nvidia and AMD had struck deals with the Trump administration to gain access to semiconductor export licenses. These deals include sharing 15% of revenue from China sales with the government. And on August 11th, during a press conference, Trump also said that Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang was, quote, coming to see him about licenses for degraded Blackwell chips. Can you tell me about this press conference with President Trump?
Yeah, we learned a lot in this press conference that President Trump had on August 11th. And the entire section where he's talking about the negotiations with Nvidia, how this deal came together, actually, I would say contradicts some earlier statements that we had gotten from the administration, specifically that Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick had stated in terms of the H20 deal being a deal with China, not a deal with Nvidia, and being negotiated to remove export controls from China on rare earth magnets. So I know not everybody is going to be excited to hear me read some long quotations from President Trump and Secretary Lutnick, but I think it's actually pretty important to get the full picture of the story. So bear with me, folks. Here we go. This is President Trump, and no, I'm not going to do a bad impersonation. I'm just going to read it at a regular voice. And I deal with Jensen, who is a great guy, and Nvidia. The chip that we're talking about, the H20, it's an old chip. China already has it in a different form, different name, but they have it, or they have a combination of two, will make up for it, and even then some. Now, Jensen's a very brilliant guy, and Jensen has a new chip, the Blackwell. Do you know what the Blackwell is? The Blackwell is super duper advanced. I wouldn't make a deal with that, although it's possible I'd make a deal, a somewhat enhanced in a negative way Blackwell. In other words, take 30 to 50% off of it. But that's the latest and greatest in the world. Nobody has it. They won't have it for 5 years. But the H20 is obsolete. You know, it's one of those things, but it still has a market. So I said, listen, I want 20% if I'm going to approve this for you, for the country, for our country, for the US. I don't want it myself. You know, every time I say like 747, I want yeah for the Air Force. So I just want it. So when I say I want 20, I want for the country. I only care about the country. I don't care about myself. And he said, will you make it 15? So we negotiate a little deal. So he's selling a essentially old chip that Huawei has a similar chip, a chip that does the same thing. And I said, good. If I'm going to give it to you because they have a stopper, what we call a stopper, not allowed to do it, they restrict it. It's really known as a restrictive covenant. And I said, if I'm going to do that, I want you to pay us as a country something because I'm giving you a release. I release them only from the H20. Now, on the Blackwell, I think he's coming to see me again about that. But that will be an unenhanced version of the big one. Like, I don't know if you know it, we will sometimes sell fighter jets to a country and we'll give them 20% less than we have. You know what I mean, right? So there's a lot in that quote. But I think the big thing here is, first, he's negotiating this deal directly with Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang. So that is President Trump confirming a lot of the speculation around this, that it was Jensen's visit to the White House that did move the needle in the overall negotiations. The second thing, as he's saying, is he does want, there to be this 15% markup that the government is going to capture off the value of the H20s that are sold to China. Now, think about this for a second. It's President Trump who is making the comparison to fighter jets in this story, right? So he's talking about national security sensitive items, these H20 chips, and he's saying that because Nvidia is going to pay the government money, the United States is going to overlook those national security concerns. Notice that this is a very different narrative from what you heard from the Secretary of Commerce previously. He had said that actually selling the chips would be a national security benefit because it would enhance China's dependence on American technology. President Trump does not make that point. President Trump does not say that selling H-20s to China is good for U.S. national security. He says that we're going to get more money. And that's the benefit that the United States is extracting from this story. And there I simply have to disagree. I suppose one could make the argument that there is some dollar figure where it would be in America's national security interest to sell China advanced AI chips, right? If China had offered and was legitimately willing in this farcical scenario I'm about to offer, but if they were willing to pay $30 trillion for the chips, right? Well, that's more than all of U.S. GDP for an entire year. We could fund the Department of Defense for 30 years off of that money. So yes, you could have a national security return on investment positive approach to selling China the chips at that price. Nvidia has said that their write-off for the H20s that they had previously negotiated deals to, but then they had to cancel those deals. When they were talking to their investors, they said the write-off of the value of all those deals when the H20s were going to be banned was $5 billion. So what is 15% of $5 billion? It's in the ballpark of like $600 million. Is $600 million going to undo the national security risk of this situation? Like, who is going to extract more benefit from this situation in national security terms? Is it China or is it America? I would say it is China by a wide margin, and $600 million comes nowhere close to making that calculation different. And I think it's fair to say that the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, agrees with me, or at least he did in his June 11th CNBC interview. This is where he was saying that he viewed chip export controls as critical to national security and that the administration would not budge despite frequent requests from China during trade negotiations. So here's what Secretary Lutnick told CNBC on June 11th. Quote, "The Chinese side always wants to remove our export controls. You know, they always try to remove our export controls. And Scott Bessent, that's the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent gave one of my favorite lines of the whole negotiation. He said, 'Really? No. So you want no export controls? Fine. I'd like to take home a couple of your best hypersonic missiles, please. Can I have them?' So it was just disarming." So what Secretary Lutnick is saying in that is that, number one, export controls are a part of U.S. national security. China is asking for them constantly, and America is saying no, and they're explicitly saying, hey, you, China, you have export controls too on stuff like your advanced hypersonic missiles, some of which are arguably better than America's. Are you going to sell those to us? That kind of a thing. And apparently that went over well in the negotiation. So here's what Lutnick then went on to say. Quote, "We are competing with China in the AI race, okay, for sure. So we are just not going to give them our best chips. And of course they want them. Americans are the greatest inventors in the world. We are the greatest thinkers in the world, the greatest entrepreneurs in the world. All the greatest chips in the world are American, right? So of course they want them, and of course they want to use them. And of course we said absolutely not. Did they ask? Did they ask 20 times, 30 times? Of course they did. They do every time. And we always say no." So there is Secretary Lutnick saying China asked him 20 or 30 times to remove these advanced AI chip export controls, and the administration did not budge. It did not budge on national security grounds. Now, fast forward a bit. That was June 11th. July 15th, Secretary Lutnick told Reuters in an interview that resuming H-20 sales was part of the trade deal with China to eliminate export controls on rare earths, magnets, and other critical minerals. He said, quote, "We put that in the trade deal with the magnets." Here's the thing. President Trump just said the opposite. He said it was not part of the trade deal with the magnets. And if you listen to what Lutnick says elsewhere in terms of the punitive export controls that were express U.S. retaliation for the Chinese export controls on rare earths, he's talking about things like ethane export controls. He's talking about jet engine part export controls. He was not saying that part of the coercive leverage that the United States was putting in retaliation for rare earth and critical mineral export controls was the H-20s. The H-20s was a separate decision made on national security grounds. And President Trump undid that decision. He undid that decision, and he did it for 15% of NVIDIA's revenue. And I think we have one final data point, right, that says that it was not part of the deal to eliminate the export controls on rare earths. And this is something that we talked about in the last podcast, but I'll just refresh it here. This is the July 18th press release from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, where it said, quote, "We noticed that the U.S. side recently, again, on its own initiative, expressed that it will approve the sale to China of NVIDIA H20 chips." So China says it wasn't part of the deal. President Trump says it wasn't part of the deal. Lutnick had said it was part of the deal. I just don't think that that's credible now that we have all of this information. And I think the national security implications of this deal don't come out to me in any kind of positive way. It would take way, way, way more than a few $100 million to change America's strategic national security calculus in the AI competition. But in the case of China, these AI chips can change the strategic calculation because, as we said before, the CEO of DeepSeek, the executive vice president of cloud computing at Tencent, they are all saying that the number one bottleneck that their whole country is facing in the AI race is these AI chips. And that is a problem that we just willingly solved for them. And finally, just to connect it to something I again said last time, it's true that Huawei wants to produce all the AI chips for China. It is true that China would like to stop using Nvidia in the same way that I would like China to stop using Nvidia. But they need a bridge to that future. And the question is America going to build that bridge for them to help them have a calm, smooth transition to a Huawei-dominated future? That's what we're doing with these H-20 export controls. As I said, in 2020, the Chinese government had already passed a government mandate to eliminate the use of NVIDIA chips within 3 years. It was export controls that blocked Huawei from being able to replace NVIDIA. It was export controls that killed that Chinese mandate. And they still have the same leadership. In fact, they're more hawkish now than they were then. So they are absolutely committed to getting rid of NVIDIA. We can see that right now in the cybersecurity investigations that they have against NVIDIA, in the antitrust investigations that they have against NVIDIA. And the obvious choice for China is NVIDIA now, Huawei later, because Huawei is not ready now. The Huawei chips are bad and they can't make very many of them. But if we give them a multi-year supply of NVIDIA chips, that is the bridge to their Huawei future. We should not be building them that bridge. That's my conclusion on this story.
Well, I highly encourage any of our listeners who didn't catch last week's episode to go back and listen to that one, because we did talk through the entire timeline and the existing debate up to this point. Now I want to ask about how the same groups that were criticizing the unbanning, how they're reacting to these deals. I'm talking about criticism from folks in Congress, previous Trump officials, a broad group of national security experts.
Yeah, I can't find anybody in the United States national security community who is in favor of this deal. And what I mean by that is even the people who were in favor of selling H20s through the logic of, we're perpetuating Chinese dependence on Nvidia chips. That's a logic I don't subscribe to, but the point is there are people out there who subscribe to it. I can't find anybody in the national security community who is defending a deal that is a 15% export tax on Nvidia, saying that somehow this is good for U.S. national security. So let's hear from Republicans. Representative Molinar, the chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, said, quote, "Export controls are a frontline defense in protecting our national security, and we should not set a precedent that incentivizes the government to grant licenses to sell China technology that will enhance its AI capabilities." Representative Krishnamurthy, who's the Democratic ranking member on the same committee, he released a statement saying, quote, "Most troubling is the contradiction at the heart of this potential policy. The administration cannot simultaneously treat semiconductor exports as both a national security threat and a revenue opportunity. By putting a price on our security concerns, we signal to China and our allies that American national security principles are negotiable for the right fee." There's a few other people whose statements out here I think are insightful, and I want to quote them as well. One is Liza Tobin, who served in the first Trump administration on the National Security Council. She's a longtime China expert, and she told the Financial Times, quote, "Beijing must be gloating to see Washington turn export licenses into revenue streams. What's next? Letting Lockheed Martin sell F-35s to China for a 15% commission?" Or Leonard Heim over at RAND, he said, quote, "If the goal is dependency and revenue from China's AI market, why sell?" And he means why sell the chips. He goes on, "Cloud and remote access delivers both without giving away the hardware. Keep the revenue, keep some control. Selling chips is just giving away leverage for nothing." I'm inclined to agree.
So one of the concerning parts of this, in addition to the national security implications, is the 15% deal, getting 15% of the revenues. Some policy analysts have claimed that this is unconstitutional. Do you expect this 15% deal to last, or how is that shaping up?
Yeah, so if it is structured as an export tax, that is unambiguously unconstitutional. It goes back to the history of the United States and the formation of us from the Articles of Confederation into the United States of America under the Constitution. And southern states were really worried because they were large agricultural exporters. They were worried that northern states were going to tax their exports, and they were going to asymmetrically benefit in sort of a interstate competition kind of a thing. So one of the things they negotiated in writing the Constitution was no taxes on exports. It's like, that's not the exact line in the Constitution, but it's very, very close. So if it's structured as a tax on exports, it's unambiguously unconstitutional. Now, the thing is, any company is free to reach the conclusion that they are undertaxed and to offer up more money to the American government's treasury. So if Nvidia, says, hey, this is a voluntary contribution, et cetera, maybe they can do that. And even if it's structured as an export tax, courts are only going to overturn it if Nvidia sues. And Nvidia obviously doesn't want to sue because they want this deal to go forward. But let me put it a different way. Nvidia doesn't want to sue now, right, as long as this is continuing. So you could imagine a future in which, for example, Nvidia is paying all of these fees as export taxes. They're refusing to sue. And then President Trump is term limited, right? He only gets 2 terms as president under the Constitution, just like everyone else. So we're going to have a new president in 2029. Well, in 2029, Nvidia could come back and say, oh, you're changing the policy to ban these exports? Well, we want to sue you for those unconstitutional export control taxes. So I was just waxing on for far too long about how this money is nowhere near enough to allay the national security concerns. And I would just agree with those who said we shouldn't be in the calculus of thinking about, what the price is that would allay our national security concerns. But here's the thing, we might not even get to keep the money. Like, Nvidia can just sue later and get all of their money back. And so we'll have all of the national security consequences and none of the money. I really hope that this does not go forward.
So obviously, again, we always say this, we'll continue to watch this on the podcast, but what are you going to be watching for specifically with these deals?
Well, I think one of the things that was in President Trump's press conference was something about the Blackwell generation. So, and he said, I think Jensen is coming to see me soon about that. So what could he mean in that conversation? Well, number one, Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, has said specifically that he wants to be able to sell more advanced chips to China than the H20. He does want to sell the Blackwells. And I mean, that's consistently been his preference. If you go back 10 years when there were no export controls, there was no difference, or actually even just 5 years, there was no difference in the products that Nvidia sold China versus the rest of the world. So he has a demonstrated preference, right, to sell his latest and greatest stuff to China. The Blackwell chips, Nvidia is currently working on a product that would be a degraded version of the Blackwell chip. So President Trump called it enhanced in a negative way, which is an interesting use of the word enhanced. But that idea that we're going to degrade the Blackwells, the point is they're still going to be making progress. I mean, they're not going to degrade it so much that it's worse than the H20, obviously. And the H20, you call it an obsolete chip, but the strategic calculus is that it's far, far better than anything China can make, and it addresses a massive pain point in the Chinese AI ecosystem at this exact present moment. And keep in mind, when we say, that the Blackwell is the latest and greatest generation, the Hopper generation of GPUs was the state of the art less than a year ago. I mean, the Blackwells are quite new. So if we start selling degraded Blackwells, I mean, China is going to get a lot of strategic benefit from that. I sincerely hope that the administration goes back to the position that it had, that I thought Secretary Lutnick expressed extremely well, right? That, okay, if you want us to sell your AI chips, can we buy your hypersonic missiles? Are you trying to say that export controls are illegitimate? This is where I hope we end up.
Yeah. Well, to our listeners, we will continue to revisit and follow these deals as they move forward. I do want to stick on sort of the economic part of AI and move over to talking about AI as a potential spending bubble. So over the past few weeks, a wave of stories have spotlighted the unprecedented surge in AI investment, from big tech's massive infrastructure buildouts to Wall Street's growing enthusiasm. The rapid acceleration has raised concern about whether the boom could turn into a bubble. Could you start us off with a little bit of Econ 101 for those of you like myself who has not thought about Econ 101 in quite a while? How do economic bubbles form and what happens when they pop?
Certainly. And I think it's actually helpful that, this wave of stories has sort of come across the media ecosystem. It's worth pointing out that this happens from time to time. I mean, I remember when there was a lot of stories about, is the tech market a bubble in 2014? I remember it again in 2018, 2019. So you could say, hey, this just comes and it's actually not that big of a deal. Could this time be different? I think absolutely. So let's revisit, what is a bubble? Here I'm just reading the definition from Investopedia. Quote, an economic cycle that is characterized by the rapid escalation of market value, particularly in the price of assets. This fast inflation is followed by a quick decrease in value or a contraction that is sometimes referred to as a crash or a bubble burst. So the key here is that, the valuations of all the big tech companies have been going through the roof, and it's being driven by AI mania. You can see that in a lot of the valuations of these companies. You have companies like Nvidia, which is monstrously profitable, growing at an extraordinary rate, but, are they generating $4 trillion worth of revenue? Not even close. So when you think about the price of a stock, and I went to business school, so bear with me as I nerd out here. But, you can think about the fundamental value of a stock, which is, if you just think about it as, okay, companies are machines that generate money. That money can be given back to investors in the form of dividends. So when you think about what is the stock worth, you should think about how much profit it's going to make in the future. That's going to result in how many dividends and what is the sort of profit sharing on a per share basis. And then you discount the value back to what it's worth now because money in the future is worth less than money right now.
Right.
And that's how you think about the fundamental value of a stock. Anything above that, really deals with the multiple, which is just sort of how the market is perceiving different types of assets beyond what you might call the quote unquote core value. So like the core value of Pokemon cards is like really, really low, but there's a lot of people who will buy them. And so they have this value that is, beyond their quote unquote fundamental ability to generate money that is tied to market reality. And if you look where we are today with some of these companies' valuations, I thought The Economist today, August 12th, had a great story called Palantir might be the most overvalued firm of all time. And they're making the explicit connection to Cisco, which makes a lot of networking and telecommunications equipment. Well, back in the dot-com bubble, which was in the year 2000, Cisco was the world's most valuable company. And they were trading at the market valuation. So the value, if you take the value of each share of stock and you multiply it by the number of shares that exist, their valuation was 200 times Cisco's annual profit. They were worth $1 trillion 25 years ago. And that was like the peak of the dot-com bubble, which was a very painful bubble for the U.S. economy to go through. Palantir, which has had a great year in terms of revenue growth, in terms of profit growth. They're selling like crazy. Customers love their stuff.
And they're getting a lot of contracts, right?
And getting a lot of contracts with the U.S. government, among other things. But their valuation is currently $430 billion, which is 600 times this past year's profit. And I think The Economist puts in a helpful comparison here, which is if you go back to 2005, that's the year that the Oxford English Dictionary declared Google to be a verb. Well, Google's price to sales ratio was 22. 22 was the value of all their stock shares combined compared to how much profit they made this year. Palantir is at more than 600. So these valuations are sky high. They're far beyond the intrinsic value of the stock. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the value is quote unquote wrong, just like the value of Pokemon cards is just like what people are willing to pay for it, for example. But if this is a bubble, if this is like the dot-com crisis, where it's really just mania, where stock valuations become unreasonably divorced from the intrinsic value of the stocks, well, the reason why you care is that those things often tend to end badly, and they often tend to end suddenly. So what's driving, all of this mania? Well, number one, it's AI and the excitement around AI as a revolutionary technology on a par with electricity, on a par with the steam engine, on a par with the internet. It is a really legitimately transformative technology experiencing an incredible moment. Here's the thing, though. The internet was also a legitimately transformative technology. And that doesn't mean that the valuations of 1999 or 2000 were true. And especially doesn't mean they're true for every company. I mean, Amazon was around back then, and they were astonishingly valuable. And after the bubble crashed, their stock fell by more than 90%. I mean, it ultimately recovered, but there was a period of time where their valuation was so divorced from the amount of money they were making. And that was Amazon, which was a good business even then. It was a good bet even then. There was other companies that were completely vaporware. This is what I mean. Like Palantir is a good business. They make a lot of profits. The question is just like, and based on that, how much should their stock price be? Well, right now, all the companies in this sector are investing jaw-dropping amounts of money. I mean, we're looking at Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, some others like OpenAI, like Anthropic. They're looking at like nearly $400 billion in capital expenditures. That's like half of what the United States government spends on the DoD like the Department of
Wow.
Defense. So we're talking percentage points of GDP are going to be a part of AI capital expenditure this year. And that's awesome. Like, I'm so excited about that build out. I'm so excited about what it's going to do for the economy. But the question is, like, if that does not translate into a rapid acceleration in profits right away, could investors get spooked? Could there be a massive sell-off? Could that cause a lot of problems economically? Well, I think that's a plausible scenario and one that policymakers should keep in the back of their minds, even as we are excited about the potential of AI, even as we are excited about the economic opportunities of this massive wave of investment.
Well, that's sort of what I want to go into is a little bit about the scenarios here. So you mentioned that this one might be different than some of the other tech bubbles of the past. It sounds like AI could be the best thing since sliced bread when you compared it to some of these other major technologies. But what is the best case scenario here? And then on the flip side, you sort of hinted at what the worst case scenario might be, but play that out a little bit for me.
Yeah. So I think the best case scenario comes from a quote that the CEO of Google DeepMind said, Demis Hassabis. He said, quote, "It'll be 10 times bigger and maybe 10 times faster than the Industrial Revolution." That would be awesome. I mean, the Industrial Revolution really is this turning point in human history where the pace of economic growth of planet Earth changes, like, over what it had been for the preceding 10,000 years. And there's this turning point in human history after the Industrial Revolution when productivity starts going up much faster, growth starts going much faster, the quality of life starts getting much better. Demis is saying maybe it'll be 10 times faster than the Industrial Revolution, which really took like 50 to 100 years to diffuse across the British economy, not to mention, right, the world economy,
Right.
where it took even longer. So if this is 10 times bigger and moves 10 times faster, that's the biggest economic boom of all time. That's like, one of the biggest productivity enhancers of all time. And that should lead to companies reaping massive savings on their investments of AI, rapid GDP growth, rapid productivity growth, and, we address whatever the bottlenecks are in AI adoption, whether that's permitting for data centers or challenges that companies face in integrating AI with their existing business models and processes. For the best case scenario, all of those bottlenecks get addressed in a time-relevant fashion, and we're able to reap the potential of AI. I mean, if you think about the internet, the impact of the internet happened after the technology was ready, right? And that's because we didn't have broadband, to every household. We didn't have consumers comfortable with the idea of spending money online. I mean, I'm not that old, and even I remember when people were like, what? Give my credit card out to a random website online? No way, right? So there's a lot of things that will have to change as we get ready for this AI-driven economy in the same way that things had to change for us to get ready to live through the internet economy. And so what I'm trying to express here, and I'm being repetitive intentionally, is there are bubbles that are a nonsensical hoax, right? Very famously, hundreds of years ago, in the Netherlands, there was a bubble around tulip prices where people just kept buying tulips because they could sell them for more than they bought them for. And that just seemed like that would go on forever. So keep buying and keep selling and keep making a profit. But obviously, tulips, like, you're not going to base the economy on tulips. You can't build anything with them. This was all just like the Pokemon card, not intrinsic value kind of thing.
Right.
So my point is, some bubbles can be because of like nonsensical hoax situation. Some bubbles can be like the internet. Absolutely legitimate, massive economic opportunity and transformative technology. I would say that AI is definitely, in the worst case, in that second category, where it's still a transformative technology, but the valuations are crazy and we still have some financial disruption based on that. Okay, so we talked about the best case. I just talked a little bit about the worst case, but let me elaborate for a moment on the worst case. I think one question is like, how long do these AI breakthroughs take to mature to the economy in a way that's disruptive? I mean, like, we know that people are using AI to an astonishing amount. OpenAI disclosed recently that they're up to 700 million weekly average users. So that's like most people in America who have a job, presumably, are interacting with AI platforms and ChatGPT specifically at this stage. The question is, like, how far are they from their current use case to generating meaningful increases in their economic productivity? Like, if they're using ChatGPT for entertainment, that's not necessarily bad for the economy, but it's not the same kind of, massive opportunity if they're using it to enhance like their overall economic productivity, which is what we need for this to go through. So one is like, the productivity benefits are farther away than we think. I mean, we already know about some fields where productivity growth is really significant, like coding is the obvious one, where coders say, their productivity is amazing. Big tech companies say they're slowing the hiring of engineers because the productivity growth is so good that they can reduce their hiring requirements. The other thing is that, like, some of these projects, companies are, raising enormous amounts of money, and if they're not able to pay their investors back pretty quickly, that's going to raise questions about the next tranche of money that they need. Nobody has told me about firms like OpenAI and OpenAI and Anthropic and others. They're definitely seeing rapid revenue growth, but that's not the same as being cash flow positive from operations. They're still having to bring on more and more investment to fuel that growth. And the sort of question is, ChatGPT gives away GPT-5 access for free. So, like, what percentage of their operational costs, and here I'm not even talking about, the building out of massive infrastructure that is underway, but just operating the infrastructure they have, how far away are they from cash flow positive from operations? Those are the kinds of questions that investors kind of are not asking today because they're just so excited about the AI boom that they're willing to pay any price. But in the future, you could certainly imagine they are. And I think if you look at some of the companies which have zero revenue, right? ChatGPT has a lot of revenue. Anthropic has a lot of revenue. Google has a lot of revenue. There are other companies, some of them founded by alumni from OpenAI and others, that are attracting sky-high valuations in the tens of billions of dollars and doing that with no revenue. And that doesn't mean inherently, automatically, that we're in a bubble. But it definitely is one of the things that would happen if we were in a bubble. And so it's something to pay attention to.
So obviously underlying all of this is an assumption that adoption needs to take place. Let's go back to the government and talk about government adoption of AI. So on August 5th, the U.S. General Services Administration, GSA, added OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google as approved AI vendors. This news is the latest development in a string of government efforts to encourage government adoption of AI. I want to know what this GSA approval means for agencies' access to AI.
Yeah, so folks out there who are not familiar with the General Services Administration, I forgive you. It's not exactly a household name, but it's actually a pretty important organization. And the reason here is, like, there's a million billion regulations on what it means to sign a contract with the United States government. And that is a lot of complexity, not just for companies to navigate, but for the government to navigate. And so, just negotiating contracts on behalf of the government can take months and months and months. The General Services Administration, I mean, they have a lot of jobs. They have a big real estate portfolio that they manage on behalf of the government. They have a lot of other important jobs to do. But one of the things that they do is manage big contracts that the entire government has access to. So it's not like a DoD contract where the DoD can use it, or a Department of Energy contract where the Department of Energy can use it. When the GSA signs a contract, it's open and available to most or all of the federal government. And so if you're thinking about, like, how do we accelerate AI adoption, the fact that there are now what we would call in government speak contract vehicles for purchasing AI services through the GSA, that means that the complexity to navigate for any government agency, for any government office, for any government individual to get access to AI capabilities just went way, way down. And when you think about, like, some of the hurdles that make all of this more complex, like security concerns, like cybersecurity concerns, like access to cloud services and the conditions under which that is or is not allowed. Again, the GSA has sort of navigated a lot of that complexity on behalf of the entire federal government. And so this is not a guarantee, but this is certainly a big window for accelerating AI adoption across the entire federal government. And you're seeing, interesting maneuvers by companies in this regard. OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, for example, said that he was going to offer ChatGPT services to the entire federal government at a price of $1 per employee. Now, like what their usage thresholds look like, I don't know. There's some unanswered questions at this stage. Yeah. But that's really interesting. And it means that for every government agency, the cost of trying it out is pretty low, right? To just like interacting with the chatbot, playing around with it. Now, there's so many things that they have to think about. Like, number one, how do you make sure that data that's supposed to be kept secure is kept secure, right? Like, for example, when you're in the government and you're doing anything with personnel and human resources, you're interacting with a lot of Social Security numbers. In the government, you're not allowed to email Social Security numbers around unless those emails are encrypted, for example. So you don't necessarily, and there's a lot of like sensitive personal information, medical information, et cetera. You don't want to just casually upload those up to AI chatbots or, sensitive information about government operations, whether or not it's like an individual privacy concern. You want to make sure that when you're using these platforms, the data is going to remain protected in the way that the law demands it be protected, and also in the way that common sense, demands that it needs to be protected. So those are the kinds of questions that, operational adoption is going to have to wrestle with. But it does seem to me that, the foot is being put on the accelerator. And I think that's just an exciting opportunity for the United States. I'm excited to see how it goes.
Yeah, connecting it back to the last segment, I mean, it'll be just interesting to see if that also drives higher numbers of productivity, even just having access in an integrated way. I assume there's a lot that they have to do to prepare for this beyond just the security concerns, actually being mindful about, what does it mean to use AI in the government? Have you heard of any steps that they're taking to approach this sort of large scale adoption?
Yeah, and I think here there's a good analogy to be made with the digitalization of government affairs. When I was in the government, we had this thing called the Defense Travel Service, which was basically just like Expedia or Kayak or Google Flights, for purchasing flights when you are a government employee and purchasing it with a government, payment account. Well, the Defense Travel Service was based on old regulations that had been written, for what it meant to buy air travel. And one of the things in the government is, because they don't want, wasteful spending of taxpayer money, is that your supervisor has to approve the purchase of the flight. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism to route the flight ticket attempt to purchase to your supervisor for approval. And I guess like when the regulations were written, it said like your supervisor has to stamp it approved. And so when you go to the Defense Travel Service as a supervisor, as I was, there's a button that says stamp approved.
To literally stamp
it. Yes,
you
have to click stamp because they wanted to abide by that old-timey regulation. And so my point here is that just because you're moving from paper and ink and stamps to digitalization did not inherently mean you got this big productivity boost. If you just took the same process that you used when it was paper and ink, and you use that same process, but in a digital format, you might get no productivity improvement. You might get a tiny fraction of the potential productivity improvement. The big productivity improvements from digitalization came from process re-engineering, where you're like, okay, because this exists, we can do this an entirely different way. We don't need a massive mail room in the basement with a bunch of people who walk around with shopping carts delivering mail. We don't need, all of these approaches that we take because we're running the world on paper and ink. We can re-engineer our processes to take advantage of digital reality. And the same is going to be true for AI. I think that while I'm excited to give a lot of people in government, access to chatbot capabilities and use that to enhance their work. I think the obvious truth is that the vast majority of the productivity improvements are really only going to kick in when you think about the process reengineering part of the story. Like, what are we going to do differently than we did in the pre-AI era? And how are we going to make sure that we actually generate the productivity improvements, generate the cost savings, et cetera? That's not just to take your old process and throw AI on top of it. You really have to re-engineer the process. And that's a complicated thing to accomplish. A lot of organizations struggle with that. And the government historically has struggled with that massively because government employees often love to brag. Like, if you go look at the online biography of just about any general in the United States military, it will say they are in charge of, so many tens of thousands of people and a budget of X, right? They brag about how much they're responsible for. They don't brag about how much cost they cut. They don't brag about how efficient, operations became under them. And that's just because bureaucracies often incentivize little empire building. They don't incentive always inherently incentivize efficiency. And so that can be a challenge when you're trying to seize the opportunities of transformative technologies, which I do think AI is.
Well, I'm really excited to see what numbers come out after all this is sort of up and running. I'm sure we will analyze it here when it does. I think that does it for this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Greg, thank you so much for joining me. To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning back in. Great conversation as always, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brielle. Thanks for listening to this episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe and tell your friends. It really helps when you spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Sadie McCullough, and Matt Mand. See you next time.